It was the world's most visited monument up until April the 15th, 2019. It was on that evening that flames threatened to destroy it. Its spire did, however, succumb.
It was like a knife in the back. I felt my muscles give way. Something that never should have happened had just occurred.
Nevertheless, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris is still standing. 48 meters wide, 127 meters long, with two towers 69 meters high, which were, for a long time, the French capital's tallest. It's as monumental as its designer, Bishop Maurice de Sully, had hoped it would be.
The idea of scale is, from the very start, one of the main considerations of Notre Dame. It is huge. It is huge for its time.
The reason this 12th century Gothic masterpiece resisted the fierce fire was thanks to its original design. The builders constructed two gigantic stone vaults, which are still standing 35 meters high. They were the highest vaults in Europe at the time they were built.
Erecting a 35-meter vault was an undisputed record for the Western world.
A bulwark against the ravages of time, as symbolized by its colossal foundations, dug deep into one of the most unyielding soils of Paris.
All this vast work was invisible, but in itself was a masterpiece, a hidden masterpiece.
In order to guarantee Notre-Dame's total stability, gigantic flying buttresses were added, the largest of their kind in the world, with a reach of 12 meters.
These master masons were brilliant designers, and they were able to make something so big, so strong, sit on these sort of spider legs.
For 800 years, the cathedral's wooden framework, nicknamed the Forest, was a structure made from 1,200 oaks and protected the stone until it went up in flames. Its only Achilles heel in the event of fire was the oversized spire, erected by Viollet-Le-Duc in the 19th century. It was a massive superstructure made out of 750 tons of wood and lead, weighing the equivalent of 3 airliners. This is the story of how Notre Dame was born, and how it resisted fire and the test of time. In the eyes of the world, it was the incarnation of medieval architecture and considered changeless and impregnable.
One of the most horrible things I've ever seen is the spire collapsing in a blaze into the nave.
When the fire got close to the front, we began to worry about the whole of the building.
This world-favorite historical monument was wounded to the core.
The next morning, when we turned on the news, it was sort of a relief. I mean, it wasn't good. It was a terrible fire. But there was also the feeling that, yes, the Gothic system, fireproofing, on some level does work.
An ancient but perfect Gothic system of fireproofing, thought up by its builders more than 8 centuries ago.
The big technological innovation in architectural terms was the vault. They were very quick to understand the need to have vaulted buildings to limit major damage.
Notre Dame is a feat of pure architectural engineering from the Middle Ages. And yet no trace of its builder's intentions remains. In order to crack the secrets of its strength, you have to make the stones talk and turn back the clock to the middle of the 12th century. In 1160, Paris was a bustling town of 25,000 inhabitants. It was a town on the rise, but it didn't yet have its cathedral. Impressive Gothic structures had already been built in Laon, in Noyon, and in Sens.
We suddenly have this explosion of great cathedrals, so that there is not only an enormous amount of wealth coming to the cities, but also the need of the bishops to have cathedrals that are in some way representational and worthy of the new status of the town.
Like his peers, the ambitious Bishop of Paris, Maurice de Sully, wanted a cathedral, especially as he had the means to build one.
The bishop owned a huge amount of land in part of the capital. He was an important lord whose income was immense.
Huge income and sacred land right in the middle of Paris on the Ile de la Cité. There were probably several churches there already, the main one being dedicated to Saint Etienne. But it was undoubtedly too small and decrepit for the new Bishop of Paris, and Maurice de Sully wanted it demolished. His ambition was to build a cathedral as good as the Basilica of Saint-Denis, 10 kilometers to the north of Paris. Rebuilt between 1130 and 1144 by the Abbé Suger, it was the burial place for the kings of France and helped launch the explosion in Gothic architecture. All that's left of this frenzy today is the ambulatory.
When the people of the Middle Ages discovered the basilica and the choir, they would have noted that light was present everywhere. The walls had gone. It was just a forest of pillars, making it a single space, with open bays and apses. It was a radical change.
This feat was made possible by a structural element which alone was the symbol of Gothic architecture: the rib vault. Up to that time, if religious buildings had vaults, they would have been barrel vaults. Heavy, tunnel-like forms which exerted a considerable and continuous pressure on the side walls.
If you take a sheet of paper, for example, and fold it to make a tunnel, then you press on the top of the paper, you can easily feel the paper presses down on the sides.
To counteract this pressure, the walls were often extremely thick and heavy, using up so much material that it was difficult to build them high or to open out the building. But by combining two rib vaults, the medieval builders realized that the load could be transmitted downwards to the rows of columns.
And so they realized that the wall in between was no longer needed.
Being light and using fewer materials, rib vaults enabled buildings to gain considerable height. And once they were covered by stone panels, the building would be protected from any fire that might break out in the wooden rafters above.
It made great good sense to use them, and it had this beautiful aesthetic effect of these diagonal lines crisscrossing across space. The old buildings at Notre-Dame couldn't begin to compare with that.
Maurice de Sully wanted his building to have the most impressive rib vaulting ever constructed, in order to make it the reference in Gothic monuments. But he needed an exceptional architect to carry this out. In the 12th century, architects were very often trained in masonry. They were called master masons.
The Gothic master masons who were working for Sully, we don't have their names. These people were incredibly thoughtful with their understanding of geometry and engineering.
They needed someone who could create the cadences, the proportions, based on simple geometric plans.
We have no idea who Notre-Dame's first master mason was, but Maurice de Sully more than likely chose the most ambitious and audacious mason of his time.
What might we imagine them saying? We want a building that is very modern and very up-to-date. We want something that will also soar above the city and affirm the power of the cathedral. What can you do for us, Master Mason?
Under the watchful eye of Maurice de Sully, the first master mason produced plans for a gigantic cathedral. Its scale was exceptional. Notre-Dame would be the largest church in the Paris region, measuring 48 meters wide and 127 meters long. In France at the time, only the Cluny Abbey was larger.
I think the idea of scale is, from the very start, one of the main considerations of Notre-Dame. It is huge. It is huge for its time.
I do think it's helpful to think of the cathedral as a civic stadium, in a sense, because it's where so many important rituals and ceremonies needed to take place, and a small building is actually a safety hazard.
The extraordinary surface area was matched by its height. The interior width of the building required that the vaults rise to 35 meters, making Maurice de Sully's cathedral the highest vaulted building in the Western world.
In the West, erecting a vault to such a height, 35 meters, was an undisputed record. It was almost beyond human scale. It was a work which could be said to have been divinely created. Technically, it seemed almost beyond belief.
The master mason chose to build 6-part rib vaults, or sexpartites, comprised of 3 arches and 3 vaulted panels. This strengthened the structure, almost certainly reducing the risk of collapse.
It's a very brilliant aesthetic choice because it expands the width of the space.
Having a sexpartite vault spreads out the distribution of the mass in a very elegant solution.
The feat of Notre-Dame was in having this combination of monumental vaults and remarkably thin walls, which happened to be no thicker than those of Haussmannian buildings in Paris. In order to ensure the stability of these thin walls, the thrust of the vaults had to be countered at a height of 35 meters. How was this done? The 12th century master mason had an audacious solution: to build clearly visible exterior buttresses.
Buttresses are essentially like crutches. They come to aid of extremely ambitious monuments. What made Notre-Dame innovative was choosing buttresses from the word go, because the gigantic scale of the project required them.
The 12-meter-long flying buttresses of Notre-Dame were the largest in the world. They had a double function: to transfer the thrust of the vaults from the interior supports to the exterior ground level, and secondly, to protect the building from the wind. It was entirely possible that at 35 meters high, the wind could cause the building to simply collapse by exerting unsustainable pressure.
If the flying buttresses were to disappear, yes, Notre Dame would still stand, but not in a terrible storm.
The buttresses were originally built for technical reasons, but were impressively sculpted. Their spider-like form is unrivaled elsewhere. Maurice de Sully was insistent that his new cathedral should not just be technologically innovative, but should also go down in history. The master mason's response can be seen in the cathedral's decoration, particularly in the towering antique-inspired columns of the choir and the nave.
The idea of the column is an idea about antiquity, and we want to think about Paris wanting to be ancient. It wants to emphasize the Roman past, the distinguished Roman past.
As well as these columns, which are spread evenly throughout the building, the link to the past would be reinforced by dividing the cathedral into 5 sections. A central section and 2 aisles either side evoke the first pre-Christian basilicas, but also the Church of Saint-Étienne, which Notre-Dame would replace.
Replicating the 5 sections was a way of giving a certain substance, a certain reverence to the new building. This was legitimate because not only did it emulate the past, but also it didn't undermine old habits. Canons, pilgrims, worshippers who had known the old cathedral and who came to the new nave of Notre-Dame could find the same areas as in the old building. They wouldn't be shocked or upset.
Notre-Dame de Paris, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, was to be the largest cathedral ever built at the time. The master mason would have to prove himself to be equal to the grandiose plans.
He also has to think, how on earth am I going to build this in the constrained territory that I have on the Ile de la Cité? I need to have carts bringing stone. I need to have space for the forge, and I need to have fire, and I need to have sand. I need all these materials somehow to congregate at a site. It's like planning an invasion.
Over 860 years of building work began in the year 1160. Notre-Dame required colossal foundations, which would be invisible. Its contemporary, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, can help us understand construction techniques of the Middle Ages.
You can see here that they used all types of stone, sometimes abandoned stone from quarries. You can see traces of old joints. There's also cut stone, already prepared, set and squared off. All this vast work was invisible and enabled the immensity and beauty of what was to come, but in itself was a masterpiece, a hidden masterpiece.
So how was this hidden masterpiece designed and constructed? The building work started in Notre-Dame with the choir. The first stage was to dig deep enough to find strong enough soil to hold the colossal amount of stone for the building's foundations. The geological conditions of Ile de la Cité weren't favorable. They had to keep digging all the way down to a depth of 9 meters.
Nine meters down, you have to take the height of the quayside you can see behind me, which is about 6 meters, and add half the depth again in order to reach the level at which the foundations were laid. Not only is the level very deep, but it's submerged in water.
Every winter, the water would rise, the soil would be affected, and the foundations would become unstable, not solid enough. There was a huge risk of the land slipping under the cathedral's foundations, causing the work to be deformed higher up.
To ensure the stability of the foundations in this waterlogged soil, the master mason decided to sink huge wooden stakes deep into the subsoil.
Sinking poles into the riverbed underneath the foundations was a way of preventing the foundations being washed away and the cathedral being deformed.
Once these stakes were in place, the builders were able to construct the foundations with limestone and mortar.
They're going to create a kind of network of foundations, and they're going to look a little bit like a pyramid. They're going to be wider at the base and narrower at the top as you rise to ground level.
At 9 meters deep, the foundations of Notre-Dame had another peculiarity. Just like at Saint-Denis, parts of old religious buildings, demolished to make place for the cathedral, were used. As with these column bases.
In those days, stones had power. They radiated. They were charged with energy, like our modern-day batteries. To put it simply, they transmitted a symbolic force, and they bestowed on the walls not only protection, but also continuity with ancient buildings.
The foundations, built during the 1160s, were one of the main strengths of the cathedral. This strength was combined with the power of the stone. It was present in the Parisian subsoil, ready to be picked like ripe fruit.
The raw materials necessary were found in the surrounding hills. Sedimentary rock deposited 45 million years ago, according to the geologists, in warm, shallow seas, which sound lovely, leaving magnificent limestone, typical of the center of the Paris basin.
The slopes of the River Seine and its tributaries had banks of limestone. The Seine carried them all the way into Paris, and thus provided the building site with all its needs.
Even though Notre-Dame was built in stone, it could not be finished without another material: wood. Wood scaffolding was essential in the building of the cathedral. The wood came from forests owned by the bishopric.
When we look at a cathedral now, we don't think about wood. But we would not be able to build a cathedral without vast amounts of wood coming up as a kind of frame all around the stone walls as they emerge from the ground.
Thanks to wood, stone, and the skill of its builders, the cathedral's choir took shape. Within a few years, they'd got as far as the galleries. While the builders erected the clerestories, they also started on building the flying buttresses with a 12-meter reach. These would ensure the stability of the vaults to come.
Building such arches was a technological challenge.
It must have blown everybody away. I mean, it was a spectacle, in a sense, to see these external arches rising up so high to support the walls and the roof.
Once this was completed, iron hooks would be inserted into the masonry to reinforce and strengthen the walls. But before constructing the vaults, the building needed a wooden framework to cover it. The first one would be replaced during the following century, but its role was vital.
It was important to erect the framework before the vaults, because the framework obviously protected the building, but also gave it a bulk, filled it out to such an extent that the walls were braced and wouldn't move. Once the framework was up, then the materials required for constructing the vaults could be levered up by special mechanisms.
A treadwheel crane, or squirrel cage, was one of these mechanisms. Charges of up to several hundred kilos could be lifted by rope and pulley, activated by a wheel, turned by two men walking inside the crane.
The cage was a motor which, along with a rope and a pulley mechanism, enabled anything to be lifted up to 100 meters high. The squirrel cages were so important in the Middle Ages that they turned up in illuminated manuscripts. Such was the pride in the devices.
The huge wooden timbers intended to support the vault arches were almost certainly raised into the cathedral rafters thanks to a squirrel cage.
When those vaults are going up, they were the highest in the known world, and they were therefore some of the most ambitious building projects in Europe at the time.
The second stage of the construction of the vaults involved the masons placing the stones on the timbers, one by one, starting with the keystone. The rest of the stones, already cut to size, were placed afterwards and fixed with mortar.
The keystone is put in place first because its position determines where the center is. This then enables the timbers to be repositioned, and the necessary material for the rib vault can be laid out.
Here they're doing this for the first time so high. Imagine the impact of this on people walking by and seeing these arches up in the air and thinking, oh my goodness, how is this ever going to stand up?
Once the arches were in place, they could be used as a fulcrum to construct the panels. The last stage was the most delicate of all, when the timbers were removed. This was when the risk of collapse was at its highest. However, there has never been any recorded trace of any accident involving these record-breaking 35-meter high vaults.
The construction of the vault started with the positioning of the arches, and then that of the panels above them. They were gigantic, covering almost 100 square meters.
In spite of their relative thinness, between 20 to 30 centimeters, Notre-Dame's vaults proved to be incredibly efficient during the fire of April the 15th, 2019. They bear witness to the genius of their medieval builders, protecting the major part of the cathedral not only from the flames, but from the thousands of liters of water used to put out the fire from above. In 1177, the cathedral choir was consecrated just 17 years after the work had been instigated by Maurice de Sully. Since it was closed off from the rest of the construction, it was able to house a whole set of sacred relics from the Paris Sea. Objects that had belonged to saints or fragments of their bodies, revered by worshippers.
You can think of the relics as the presence of the sacred on earth.
I like to think of sacred relics as the battery that powers the machine of a sacred building.
Amongst these relics, a strand of hair supposedly belonging to the Virgin Mary, a stone that had been used to lapidate Saint Etienne, or an arm that allegedly belonged to Andrew the Apostle.
So we're talking about an arsenal of holy weapons, there to protect not just the community of the dean and his chapter and the bishop and his power, but the whole city of Paris.
April the 15th, 2019. The wooden frame and roof of Notre-Dame caught fire. 1,200 oak beams nicknamed the Forest. A forest fire, the cathedral's weak point. And yet, despite the apparent fragility, the frame was robust and indispensable.
The weight of the frame held everything together. Without this pressure point, the side walls of the cathedral would have had to withstand the thrust of the vaults on the inside and the thrust of the buttresses on the outside. Not necessarily everywhere, only at certain points. So the weight of the whole frame ensured the adherence of the whole and prevented the walls undergoing too much strain.
The frame was a real plus point for the safety of the cathedral.
We knew that if ever there was a problem with fire, then the frame would indeed burn, but it would save the building. That's part of its DNA, built into its design by the master masons of the 12th and 13th centuries.
The forest of Notre-Dame was designed to self-destruct in the event of fire. It no longer exists, but it was identical to the frame of the Cathedral of Notre-Dame of Rouen, one of the most perfect examples of its time.
The best techniques could be found in Rouen, as well in most wooden frames in the kingdom at the time. Everything was coordinated between the master mason and the master carpenter. There was an overall design.
Notre-Dame's wooden frame had already been rebuilt once. Why did the cathedral's master mason and the carpenters decide on this structure? And how can we explain its resilience for 8 centuries? The answers to these questions can be found in what happened during the night of August the 14th, 1218. On the eve of the holy day of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, thieves broke into the premises of Notre-Dame's canons.
One source identifies one of these thieves as an Englishman. They crept up into the upper parts of the cathedral and tried to sort of levy themselves down to steal these sacred liturgical vestments and vessels in the night. And something went wrong. A candlestick of some sort was knocked over, and the choir caught fire.
Notre-Dame caught fire for the first time in its history. We don't really know the full consequences of this fire, but it helped to launch a huge campaign of new work during the 1220s.
During the same period, the construction of the Cathedral of Chartres was coming to an end. It had enormous windows, whereas Notre-Dame didn't. And then, all of a sudden, Notre-Dame apparently needed changing, modernizing, and upgrading. You can imagine the sort of site meeting with the master mason, with the stonecutters and the other artisans saying, "Just give us the order. We've been to Chartres, seen what they've done there, and we can do better."
Doing better meant letting more light in by opening Notre-Dame's windows, a new challenge for the medieval builders. It meant modifying the roof and completely rebuilding the wooden frame. It was a structure which was over 100 meters long, 10 meters high, 13 meters wide, and worryingly unstable.
A wooden frame has a major impact on the stability of a building, as it creates pressure points and a great deal of thrust points.
Pressure points carried chiefly to the sides by rafters.
Rafters are the very long beams of wood that support the roof covering. They carry the weight to the outside. It's important to have joists at the base, which are pieces of wood linking the rafters, and which will reduce the spread of the frame. If the whole device is not solid enough, the frame will push down onto the stonework, and the section could collapse.
The main problem with the first frame was that the vaults were inside the frame. This prevented adding any joists, which would prevent the spread of the frame. How could this mistake be rectified? The only solution was to build the wall higher and enable the new frame to have horizontal joists fitted in order to stabilize the overall structure. Other elements were added to share the load exerted by the large mass of wood and to reinforce it. The only material that could be used in this consolidation plan was the most noble of woods, oak.
Oak wood has an exceptional elasticity and mechanical resistance and an extraordinary durability. What we're concerned with is a consistency between the part of the tree which is cut and the piece of wood that is produced, since each tree provides a single piece of wood.
One tree produces a single piece of wood, so the trees have to be not only solid, but enormous.
The joists span the roof triangle horizontally and cross the whole building. So for a nave with a width of 13 meters, the joist must be 50 centimeters longer at each end, and thus tree trunks of at least 14 meters are necessary.
It's estimated that between 1,000 and 2,000 oaks were required to construct the wooden frame of Notre-Dame. Where did they find such tall trees and in such quantities? The medieval solution was to be found in a long-forgotten technique.
Trees were clear-cut, and the stumps were allowed to grow again, so forests could spring up again and keep producing wood.
This know-how enabled trees to grow quicker, higher, thinner, and straighter as they sought out the light.
After 50 to 60 years, the wood was perfectly ready for the building of cathedral frames and could be cut down.
This clever technique reduced the area that needed to be deforested. The scientists estimate that only 3 to 4 hectares of forests were required to build Notre-Dame's frame. This is the equivalent to 3 times the area of the cathedral square. The carpenters worked with axes on the young, freshly cut wood, which made the jobs of squaring and right-angling much easier.
The squaring followed the natural lines of the wood, giving it an unbeatable solidity.
If you follow my finger, you can see that the fiber has stayed intact. These pieces of wood have remained in exactly the same shape as they grew, and so they cannot be deformed.
All these pieces of wood, which ensured the solidity of the frame, were then assembled on a platform above the vaults. The forest of Notre-Dame was completed during the 1220s and protected the building from bad weather for 8 centuries. It's a mark of its flawless resistance. It also supported the striking lead roof, the steep, slender structure visible to all.
The roof covering could be seen for miles. For a long time, it was covered in gold leaf. This made it gleam in the sun, but it also shone out in moonlight.
Once the monumental roof had been completed, all that was left was to complete the towers of the cathedral. These huge towers became the face of Notre-Dame. At 69 meters high, they became the tallest buildings in Paris.
The function of these 2 towers isn't just aesthetic. The towers can be sighted from miles and miles away, but they can also be heard. So it's important to remember that these aren't just visible signs of power. They're ways of transmitting the power of Notre Dame through sound, too.
Notre-Dame's towers were erected during the decades of 1230 and 1240. It wasn't until the construction of the Eiffel Tower, 650 years later in 1889, that any building superseded them. When the towers were completed, the whole of Notre-Dame was finally ready to welcome its faithful, almost 70 years after it was started. However, more work was deemed necessary. April the 15th, 2019, 7:45 p.m.
One of the most horrible things I've ever seen is the spire collapsing in a blaze into the nave. If you study Gothic architecture, that's the last thing you ever want to see.
It was one of those moments, I think, that all of us who saw it will never forget.
The collapse of the spire of Notre-Dame was met with universal horror. It wasn't just a gigantic monument that had collapsed, but a symbol too. An architectural feat measuring 93 meters tall. This neo-Gothic colossus, weighing 500 tons of lead and 250 tons of wood, gave Notre-Dame its unmistakable flair. The collapse of the spire brought about the building's worst ever damage, taking with it parts of the vaults above the nave and the transept crossing. It was the weak point of the cathedral in the event of fire. And yet its designers had been the saviors of Notre-Dame at the time, by consolidating it, enabling it to last for centuries. (1843). For 500 years, the cathedral had had pride of place in the center of Paris. The proud building hadn't succumbed to flames, but the onslaughts of time and human activity. The statues of biblical kings had been vandalized and destroyed during the French Revolution.
Many of the stones were fractured, in other words, cracked, either by extreme cold or other conditions, to such an extent that the structure was weakened.
The roof was in terrible condition. That meant water was infiltrating into the vaults. The building had been essentially abandoned for some 60 years.
Above all, Notre-Dame had had one of its limbs amputated. Its medieval spire, built during the middle of the 13th century. It was a wooden and lead construction reaching a height of 78 meters. It had become dangerous for the building and was dismantled between 1786 and 1792.
It was down to a weakness in the structure. It had shown signs of fatigue, as had many medieval spires.
The cathedral had to be saved. And it was, thanks to the novel Notre-Dame de Paris, written by Victor Hugo. The novel was so popular at the time that the whole of France rallied to save the cathedral.
Victor Hugo helped bridge to the popular imagination the importance of the Middle Ages for the identity of France, identity of Paris in particular. And so it's one of those wonderful examples when the written word, when a novel changes history.
In 1843, two architects specialized in the restoration of medieval monuments volunteered to help restore the Grande Dame to its previous glory. There was Jean-Baptiste Lassus, who was experienced and thorough, but also the hugely talented workaholic 29-year-old Eugène Viollet-Le-Duc.
He had boundless energy, had traveled extensively, drew extremely quickly, and was capable of assimilating pages of encyclopedic knowledge while continuing to run big building projects.
Viollet-Le-Duc described himself as belonging to the living and the dead. He believed himself to be the successor of medieval builders because he felt medieval and he communicated with those from the Middle Ages.
With state support, Jean-Baptiste Lassus and Eugène Viollet-Le-Duc delved into the history and the structure of the monument. They inspected every weakness, noted every defect, and proposed a complete restoration project. Their monumental work is archived and can be found just outside of Paris at the Media Library of Architecture and Heritage in Charenton-le-Pont. The archives are exceptional both in quantity and quality.
Here are 4 drawings from the 1843 competition, signed by both Viollet-Le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. In them, we can see the grand project to restore the western facade, including the gallery of the statues of kings, the restoration of all the sculpted decorations that had been set alight during the Revolution, and also a spire designed by both architects, similar to the one that had been built in the Middle Ages.
The archives attest to the colossal work undertaken by the 2 architects, and then by Viollet-Le-Duc alone, after the unexpected death of Lassus in 1857. Old stones were replaced, flying buttresses replaced, reconstruction of the sculpted decorations with the creation of dozens of gargoyles and chimera, each designed individually by the architect, such as the famous Strix.
It's almost as if Viollet-Le-Duc had given the cathedral an extra touch of soul, to such an extent that today the Strix and the gargoyles define Notre-Dame more than the figure of the building itself.
Not only did Viollet-Le-Duc give Notre-Dame more depth, but he also strengthened it, ensuring its stability. His major architectural stroke was the rebuilding of the spire. Viollet-Le-Duc and Lassus had initially imagined the spire as a simple copy of the medieval one. But after Lassus's death in 1857, Viollet-Le-Duc gave free rein to his imagination and designed an exaggeratedly large spire.
It is part of a whole kind of aesthetic system that is simply about beauty and spectacle and profoundly powerful architecture.
Although it was the heart of the Industrial Revolution, Viollet-Le-Duc intended to replicate the medieval spire. It would be covered in lead, but built out of wood, just as in the Middle Ages.
The spire was an integral part of the whole, and so it was inconceivable to use anything else but oak wood.
There was also an archaeological challenge, which involved the renewal and invigoration of ancient know-how, in particular the skills of carpentry.
In order to meet the challenge of building at a height of 40 meters, Viollet-Le-Duc needed the help of an exceptional carpenter, who was also an expert in scaffolding. He called upon a certain Boulou, who was considered the best man for the job.
So he engaged a remarkable carpenter, someone who knew how to put up scaffolding and had experimented with and improved wooden scaffolding in particular.
The spire that they designed ended up being 93 meters high, which was more than 20 meters higher than the medieval one. It would be a work of folly, embellishing the cathedral, in spite of the risk to the monument. Work started in 1858.
Viollet-Le-Duc's spire was so big that in the event of fire, serious damage to the vaults couldn't be avoided. He nevertheless took the risk that if it caught fire, there was a very good chance of it burning down. But he created it to some extent to last forever.
Viollet-Le-Duc and Boulou together created a slender, aerial structure. It was both solid and extremely heavy. It weighed 750 tons. Its chief structural element was a huge wooden pinion, braced by the rest of the framework. The structure was supported by 4 oblique arms which themselves were cantilevered on each of the transept crossing columns, the largest in the cathedral. Viollet-Le-Duc counteracted this colossal weight by consolidating the transept stonework. While doing this, he surprisingly came across the original high windows of Notre-Dame, which he proceeded to restore identically.
Juxtaposing a 12th century element with a 13th century element was a pure architectural idea and an educational one. The restoration was informative, but as an act of consolidation, it helped him to build further.
When the work was completed, the spire was assembled and raised up. It was inaugurated on August the 15th, 1859. Its completion marks the last great phase of work on Notre-Dame. A 160 years later, the worst came to pass. A gigantic bulk of burnt wood and molten lead crashed down onto the top part of the building. Even though the fire has deeply scarred the cathedral, it has nevertheless revealed its strength and ingenuity. It bears witness to each Gothic era across 8 centuries. It remains our proud heritage.
What makes a cathedral like Notre-Dame so vitally important is the combination of all the know-how and skills involved in building it.
It's exactly these types of skills and techniques that need to be passed on. That's what Notre-Dame can teach us today.
In July 2020, the French authorities decided to rebuild an identical wooden frame. This is a fitting homage to the carpenters of the Middle Ages.
We have all the wood necessary to rebuild the frame. The French forests are full of oaks. We have the know-how to use axes to square the wood. Moreover, this is the best way of guaranteeing its durability.
Notre-Dame will always be indestructible, notwithstanding its new spire, which will be recreated in wood and lead according to Viollet-Le-Duc's original plans.
The Flèche of Viollet-Le-Duc is a spectacular structure. It was visible all around the cathedral and of such great beauty. So there's every reason to maintain the appearance of the cathedral as it was before.
Is the cathedral stuck in the past? If so, it's not just any old past. Because if Notre-Dame is still standing today, it's down to the men and women who thought it up the first time and who thought it up again, to those who built it and to those who will rebuild it.